Can folks see the slides?
Yes.
All right. All right. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit today on our efforts with Playwright in the uPortal community, with the aim of having better QA, right? Having more consistent releases. People are more comfortable with upgrading, and then we have to fold in all the custom changes and whatnot, and what that might mean for adopters. So some of the outcomes today that I'm hoping that we'll be able to have as takeaways. Talk a little bit about the basics, right? What is integration testing? What is Playwright, right? How does that fit in? Talk about Playwright in uPortal, right? How has it been hooked into Gradle? Some of the nuts and bolts. Where can you find the files to work with? And then move to community testing, right? Why do we want to see Playwright in GitHub, in the community releases of uPortal, right? Using quick start data sets. How does that all fit together, and how can it benefit the community as a whole? And then move the discussion to more of an open discussion and talk about adopter testing, right? How do folks see being able to use Playwright and this idea of the community testing in your own specific adoption, as well as being able to create specific Playwright scripts in order to enhance your comfort level as you are promoting releases and changes and whatnot in up through the environments into production. If there are any questions, please feel free just to stop me and we can talk about them as they come up. All right, so talking about the basics, what we're aiming for here is integration testing in as much of end-to-end integration testing as possible, right? We don't want mocks. We don't want example data sets that really are never going to be used, or standalone databases that we hook up just for the test. We want this to be as real life as possible. A note that if the plan is for folks to use your testing scripts in prod, they must be non-destructive, right? That would be obviously a bad thing, but to keep that in mind as we talk about this kind of testing, and as you look at building out your tests, that non-destructive, while you may not be able to do as much as you want, you might be able to then leverage that in prod appropriately. Especially with uPortal, right? With a lot of other applications out there, we want to be able to test APIs as well as the user experience, right? And so there's a number of tools that we could use, right, to solve this problem, right? I mean, Selenium is kind of like the one that first comes to mind. There's Cucumber, there's Puppeteer, there's obviously Playwright. JMeter, just a note, is not a great fit in this case because it is not, it's not good for UX testing, right? It doesn't really run that JavaScript. It doesn't have that browser hook in that these other tools can support. Okay, JMeter is already integrated into uPortal and is more for performance testing. And Playwright, we've hooked it in, and it's more for this integration kind of tests. We did look a little bit at could we also use Playwright scripts to do performance testing, right? And there were some tools that could bridge that gap, because on it, by itself, Playwright is not a performance testing framework, but it could conceivably be used to do that if you have the right hardware and whatnot for it. But that turned out to be still fairly young, so we just backed off and said, hey, Playwright works for this integration flow. In terms of Playwright, what is it? It's a framework for web testing and automation. It allows a variety of browsers with a single API, and you can just change it through a configuration file. I've linked the GitHub repository It's developed by Microsoft, but it is open source with an Apache 2.0 license. Okay. Documentation, the link is also set up in the slides if folks are interested to go out and take a look at it. And one of the things that I find nice about Playwright is there's a variety of implementation languages you can use for the test scripts, right? We chose, after looking at how it integrated with Gradle, we chose to move forward with implementing the scripts in TypeScript, but you wouldn't necessarily have to stay there, right? If your wheelhouse is only Java and you're like, I just don't even want to touch TypeScript, that's still, you could still use Playwright without having to be using TypeScript. All right, so hooking Playwright into uPortal. Right now, it's based in uPortal start, and there's a README, or there's a section in the README that talks about running these tests in uPortal start, and it supports a few Gradle tasks, right? The one that you can use just right off the bat is Playwright run, and it has dependencies on several of these other tasks. So it should be a one-stop shop where you just go in, clone the repo, portal init, Tomcat start, Playwright run, and you don't have to do anything else to it, and it will go ahead and run its scripts or run the tests. Okay. There could be I could see a question coming up as why Playwright versus the other ones. I'll go back here for a second. Right, there are other tools. We sent a note out to the user group, just kind of talking about, what are your experiences with user testing and whatnot, or the integration testing, and didn't have a whole lot of response. And we had some experience with Playwright. It works well, and there wasn't any big gaps. And so we decided to proceed with Playwright. But this concept of integration testing, even if Playwright chooses or ends up needing to be sunset for a different set of tools, the idea is still the same, right? Where we want this integration testing. We'll talk about that in the last two sections. Talking about the other tasks that are available, this npx install aims to just handle all of the dependencies, right? Linting it is making sure that your Playwright scripts are set up appropriately. Formatting, same kind of idea with the lint, but just making sure that we have a consistent format across all of the test files, right? So the pull requests aren't all over the place. And then Playwright debug is helpful when things aren't going the way they should, right? And you want to be able to launch Playwright in a debug mode where it brings up a browser and you can kind of step through the different flows and to be able to see where things are going a little awry. But generally what you want to do is Playwright run. And when we look at the CI/CD flows with GitHub Actions, Playwright run is what we plan to use. So when you get into uPortal start, there'll be a few files to take a look at. And when we do the demo, I'll open some of these up. But we have a test folder, and anything that ends with spec.ts, TS is for the TypeScript, that is what's going to be picked up by Playwright and ran inside of Playwright run. You have your general config, which we'll take a look at, which is just a basic JavaScript object that you can then pass around. We have all of the credentials, right, in the quick start data set, your admin, your staff users, those kind of things. And then the uPortal PW config is more Playwright specific, and we'll take a look at that. And then not so much Playwright, but in terms of TypeScript, you have your tsconfig.json that's at the root of uPortal start. So we'll go ahead and get into the demo. Admittedly, the demo is not super exciting because all we're doing is running a script. Let me get... Oh, I need to stop the slide. There we go. All right. So I just did this, right? This is off the tip of master inside the uPortal start repo. And I'll just go back here. All I did was I ran clean portal init, and then I ran Tomcat start, and then I ran Playwright run. And you can see up here, and these are the tests that it found so far, right? And as you look at it, we tried to be kind of have a little bit of self-documenting folder structure. So you have your API folder that has your API stem in here. So we did some efforts on portlet lists last year, and we were able to build out integration tests on those. Did some efforts with analytics. And then we had some, we just kind of did some initial efforts with some existing functionality. So the search API was in here, and you can see that here. We have one UX test to show as an example that you can hit the user interface. And so we use that, you can go ahead and authenticate in, and then you could navigate to different pages in the portlet and then, inspect for different elements and whatnot. But all of these are running right now. They run off of master. So the idea is that we can then hook Playwright run into a GitHub action, and would run these every time, right? And then there's the obvious benefits of having a consistent suite of tests that are running against a lot, it's not really a live database, right? But an actual database where it has the quick start data. In terms of the files, let's go ahead and just pull that up. All right, so a test, right, looks fairly similar to other, testing methods. This is just, the TypeScript syntax, but you go ahead and you can, well, that's not very exciting, which is a better one. Here we go. So we've created some helper methods so far to help us just get into the portal to then be able to actually have some fun with figuring out what we want to test, right? So we have login via API, and then we have login via UX, right? And so in this case, we're logging in via the API. We're going to hit a URL, right? One of the portlet list or the portlet list API, and then we get back a response, and we just test it, right? Similar to like JUnit tests, we're expecting the status to be a 404, and we expect the JSON message to be this entity not found or whatever. And then just like with any other tests, you can go ahead and just expand it out as much as you need to fit your use case. Right here, we're logging in as different users doing different things with the API. And just to see how it plays nice. I believe the next one was this general config. This is a shared JavaScript object across all the tests, right? So we don't have to litter our tests with usernames and passwords. This could be a more protected file, a file that you don't put into your repo even. Since it does have passwords, but since these passwords are in the README, it's safe to do this here for the quick start data set. For your Playwright configuration, this is where you can go in, and if things aren't working or you wanted to adjust something for your specific repository clone, you can go ahead and mess with it, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, this was just kind of an initial set of configurations that we set up. And then the TS config, if you're familiar with JavaScript, this won't, or TypeScript, this will look fairly familiar. Note that we had to add this in. There was a Playwright lint issue, and so we put this in, but we have a dev task to go ahead and upgrade Playwright so we can remove this live check line. Before I continue, any questions with what Playwright is, why we chose it, how we got it into uPortal or the demo? All right. So talking a bit about community testing, right? Testing that is really not any one adopter. And so we want to use the quick start data set. So it's the same across kind of all of these flows for us. The idea is that we'll hook it into the GitHub Actions so we can run it when we open a PR. When we do releases, we want to make sure that that's in the release flow. It allows us to do quicker development, right? For those obvious reasons of you make a change, you run these tests locally, and you see something, start smoking if you broke something that you weren't expecting. Think of when you're doing dependency upgrades, right? And you're like, well, I'm upgrading this dependency. I don't think it touches these other areas. Just run Playwright, run quick against your dependency upgrade, after you make your change. And it'll give that greater level of confidence that, well, yes, in fact, it doesn't break these, at least these flows. And it's automated so we don't, which is always the issue, right? Having available hours for testing is generally, not something that we have a lot of free hours to do, right? We as a community. And so automating this will help us. There is the flip side to it, right? That if we create too many specific tests, that they become something that we now have to maintain whenever we make changes to uPortal, right? So we have to look and, not just go ahead and put an integration test on every single flow and every single element that we see on every page, but to give us that level of comfort that, the change that I'm making works, it doesn't break other things, and allows us to be nimble enough to do that without spending a bunch of manual QA hours. And like I said, we want to leverage the quick start data set. So if we need to enhance the quick starts data set, that's fine. Just understand that might that undertaking might become a little bit larger of an effort because it'll be tied into the Playwright tests. So moving into the last section, just with adopter testing. The idea is that these tests are built out and can continue to be built out as we add more functionality and bug fixes to the application. We can continue to build out the Playwright scripts, and then adopters should be able to leverage that in their specific instances. It hasn't happened to my knowledge yet, but the idea of folks building out adopter specific tests, right? Using data that's and web components and configuration that is very specific to you, and maybe some of your critical use cases that you're like, we want to test this every time and maintain that, but we want to know immediately when something starts to break. And then if you choose to, you could go ahead and set it up to run these tests prior to code promotion, right? And so that's part of just your deployment process. Yeah, I guess yeah. So talking about the adopter side of it, I'd be interested to hear from folks on if you think this could work, right? And how it could work, right? There was not a lot of chatter on the user lists, and so we thought that this would be a good forum, right, within dev days to go ahead and say, what are people doing now for this kind of integration testing? Are you using a different tool other than Playwright? And then how could you see folding in what you're doing to this community testing, just so we can continue to drive this, just a more robust learner experience in the portal. So in terms of next steps and possible improvements that I see, right, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on things that have come to mind as you've been looking at this presentation and listening to it is community buy-in, right? Because if it's really exciting for me to write Playwright scripts, but no one else really cares, right? Then, well, that's not a good solution, right? And if, there's a lot in the community that says, well, actually, this one integration testing tool works a lot better for us than Playwright, well, then we should seriously consider switching over to that at the early stages, so we don't do a bunch of effort with Playwright scripts and then we want to move over, right? Because the idea is that we have as wide of a possible user base that's interested in building out integration tests, especially to share with the community, to create just that more robust portal. We need to take a look at how do we handle PRs with these new and updated tests in uPortal Start, right? So I mentioned at the beginning that Playwright lives, the configuration lives in uPortal Start. And so when you are making changes in uPortal and you say add a new feature like portlet lists, you can go ahead and test that locally, and that's fine. But then when you put in a PR to make the, you put in a PR to uPortal, it's going to use the uPortal, it's going to bring in uPortal Start possibly to run some tests against it, and uPortal Start doesn't see those portlet list tests. If you go ahead and then add portlet list tests into the community uPortal Start repo, right, then you haven't released uPortal yet, right? So you kind of have a chicken and egg issue, and we need to work through that. Maybe it's just a configuration flag. But just to look at, as uPortal or any of the other kind of microservices or other portlet APIs are being upgraded and you want to upgrade integration tests, how do you do that in uPortal effectively? And then just that last bullet point is really going to be based on a community engagement, right? How can we find a simple flow or set of flows to enable adopters to run community tests and then to leverage their own adopter tests as well, right? There's specific flows. Maybe you're not using quick start at all, right? Maybe you completely cut that out of your portal, which is fine. But then your community test might not work out as well as you think, but maybe it will, because that global config object, all it needs to be do is tweak to be use some of your users, and it should work, right? It's kind of remains to be seen as folks get interested in this idea of more community integration testing. And that's really it. Not an incredible amount of content. I was really hoping that we'd be able to get some feedback from the adopters here at Dev Days, and then those that are watching this recording, and get some chatter going on what works for them right now, and if they think this could be useful in the future. So I'll just open it up for any questions and discussion.
You said with Playwright, we're not tied to a specific language, so we could use TypeScript or JavaScript.
Yeah, so you can, the two languages we were looking at was Java or TypeScript. And just the way that the TypeScript flow of Playwright works with the Gradle plugins, it was just simpler to go through TypeScript. But Java could be a possibility, right? If the community is like, I do not want to keep writing everything in TypeScript, but Java could be something that we could kind of rally behind. We could look at converting the existing hooks to write all of our tests in Java. And what I mean by that is, when I talk about tests, right, it's these files that end with spec.ts. These would actually be Java files that you'd be running.
Yeah, because I heard a community member likes ClojureScript instead of TypeScript.
I've not heard that Playwright has jumped that far. So
I'll see what I can get.
TypeScript. I've heard community members like TypeScript and JavaScript languages, right?
Yeah, I heard that.
I think my only comment on this is we haven't played around with Playwright specifically, but last year we did a big initiative to do kind of user acceptance testing or automated user acceptance testings, and we use Selenium specifically. I mean, that is pretty much a big market player. It works great. And we were able to do a lot of really nice, good things, and across not just uPortal, but other applications as well. The only issue that I see with it was the time consumption. So, and on two fronts. One is writing the scripts to do the test, right? And then maintaining them. So we have a bunch of business analysts, right? And one of the things we were trying to do is get them involved in creating and maintaining the test. That's where Selenium was nice, because there's some Selenium browser plugins that help them facilitate to create the actual test output. But even with that, we still needed a developer behind the scenes to massage the output of those scripts to make them work in our environments. So there's a lot of time and investment creating the scripts. And then what we realize now a year later is that the things that we want to test for, especially if you're thinking, because we were trying to validate specific data examples and making sure that a whole user workflow succeeded, right? That has to be maintained. So there's the huge maintenance effort to maintain, create the scripts, maintain the scripts. And then when we finally got to running them during the like a maintenance window, so we did try this in a maintenance window, and we did it in parallel. So we had one developer running the scripts, right? And then we had the normal business analysts doing their validation testing after an upgrade. And I don't know, I guess the confidence level that those tests, even with all the time and investment in creating them, the confidence level still wasn't there that was adequate to really make sure that everything that needed to be tested was tested. Just because you have to build up such a massive library to have enough automated tests that the confidence level was there. So that was our kind of feedback. It's really the creation and maintaining of the test is just enormous. And very unique, I think, to individuals. So the more customers are using uPortal, like this would probably be fine for your pull request. I think that's actually a really good, target to making sure that the core functionality is not being broken or altered. But from a customer end user perspective, trying to use that to validate, let's say, our own upgrades, and that any merges and code changes we've made aren't breaking. It's just a time constraint. I mean, the tool is great. I mean, Playwright, it looks very similar to what we did with Selenium as well, right? It's the time investment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Who is speaking?
Oh, sorry, this was Mark from A&M.
Okay. So would you say that the value added having at least some automated end-to-end testing as you go through your releases and code promotions is useful, or because the value, or was the value, or the confidence level so low after running an automated test that you're essentially like, yeah, we need it to check the box, but we're just going to run through all of our test cases manually anyways?
Yeah, the latter. That's essentially what we ended up doing. As I said, we did it in parallel, actually. We had the actual business analysts doing their test in parallel. And ultimately, we waited for the business analyst to say that everything was good, even though the tests were completing. Right. I think also, again, it's the library. You need a certain volume of tests to be completed to have that confidence level. And even with all the prep work, I think, I don't remember how long we spent, but probably 6 months leading up to it before we tried to do it in a production maintenance. And they worked, but we had such a small number of tests compared to the total number of tests that need to be run. And that took us 6 months distributed across 4, 5, 6 different individuals trying to build and create those tests. And we just such a small fraction of what really needs to be done. So to answer your question, I guess I think the benefit is there, but you may not realize those benefits until after several years, because you need all these tests to be slowly built little by little. And eventually you'll get to a critical point or critical mass of tests where you have enough of them that they make sense. Of course, in a pull request too, I guess that could add to it. If every time you submit a pull request, the system has to run these tests and you need hundreds of these tests to be completed, that could take the pull request could take a significantly longer time to get processed, but that may be less of a concern.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence there because already some of the components of our CI tool chain, like the one I think you mentioned the other day, Lyft. Everything else will run and complete, and then and it's still a lengthy chunk of time. That thing will run for an hour or two.
An hour or two.
Yeah,
Wow.
sometimes it lasts a real long time.
Yeah.
It's a long time because it's doing code analysis and trying to find all kinds of things. And we have a couple things turned off. It's very configurable. They're really trying to make a robust tool, and it it makes it it's doing a lot of processing.
I mean, we can see that too. In some of our CI/CD chains, we do builds. We make sure the compilations of the code are valid and successful. And we have them, some of them are around 10 minutes or so, and we find that's too long. So, and that's not doing any validation, not even any unit tests, right? So imagine if you tack that on, you're right, you could easily get to half an hour longer before you can even move forward with like a pull request or a human review or something.
Yeah, we do it somewhat in parallel, but yeah, there's plenty of times where I've waited for PR, especially when we're doing a release, because then we're trying to run through a bunch of PRs real quick.
Right.
And again, the thing that frustrates me is it happens more so in front end code that you take 15 minutes, 20 minutes to make a code change, a fix or a feature enhancement. You want to do those bug fixes. You spend a day getting dependencies straightened, build process, and back up to snub, eventually writing tests. So I think at the very least, my comment on Playwright is that we can use target APIs. We certainly want uPortal to be almost a back-end platform with a bunch of services, because we see folks leveraging it that way. So the front end is not the greatest, but there are several schools, even with custom front ends, that still rely on uPortal for groups, permissions, content lists, and other things. And then big processes that however they do, we can make sure we have these tests around quick start data for new and even current APIs. I think that'll give us some confidence, at least at that level. And then some of the basic admin tooling should have Playwright tests around it. The thing I'm concerned with is the scenario. We have to be cognizant of the fact that if any tests that rely on a certain data set, like the quick start data set, is not going to work in our environments, as you guys run them in at different institutions, and we don't want to force you to pollute your data set with quick start data, obviously. So we might even have to start looking at, okay, this should always work, and this is only for a quick start test, which that's still beneficial. But yeah, what do you think, Chris?
I can see the usefulness in that. Not that, I mean, just with the idea that having a community, having it be more for community testing, and not trying to fold in, well, how would an adopter, use the community tests and add on to them and stuff. And maybe they want to, right? But focus more on, let's get a set of tests that will demonstrate kind of core functionality, hit the components, we can run them when we're doing pull requests and releases, with the mindset that, just being aware that we don't want it to take a long time, right? Because it is already taking a long time, and we don't want to just keep on ballooning that out. But I could see that, and it makes sense that it was actually a little surprising that it was that much amount of time, Mark, to build out those tests, and it still was like, well, we still just don't have that confidence level. I mean, I can appreciate it, right? But that was a lot of effort, and I can see that it could be hard to continue to invest in that instead of just having a manual QA flow.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think this is it is the right direction. And if the systems were faster, and I think as you build things over time, you'll get to a point where you'll have a critical mass of these tests. So I think it makes sense, I think, to lay the foundation and to have something to build upon. It's just that I would not have the expectation that it's going to very quickly give you like a return on that investment of time. I think it's something that you have to kind of wait it out, and over the span of potentially multiple years, it'll eventually get to the point where you're realizing the benefit.
That makes sense.
The other difficulties is gonna be for us and probably other schools as well, is how do you authenticate these plays? Cause in the community edition, you guys know all the passwords and everything's just like blanked out, whatever, you can even strip away the authentication, whereas we're not able to really do that in ours. And then, we have Duo accounts on ours, so we have to make accounts that aren't Duo, get passwords for them. Then we have to start polluting our student databases and give these test accounts student records, or we have to impersonate students.
Or even just the whole role combinations, right?
And then it's like, oh, you can't really do that in production.
Yeah, there's certainly some concerns. So, yeah, I think you brought up some great things to think about, Chris. I think probably the focus would be what we can do, maybe split it out into some tests that can be run agnostically of the data set behind it, not require logins, and then a quick start focused Playwright set that we would run as a community in GitHub during our CI/CD pipelines for chains. And that alone will start building up several tests and give us an idea of what the effort looks like. Cool.
Yeah, I like that. I like kind of separating it out into something that anyone could run, regardless of their data set, and then continue on with the community edition.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We appreciate you taking the time and joining us remotely. It's really good to hear your voice and learn more about Playwright.
All right. Well, you're welcome. It was good to join you folks for a time.
Thank you.